At 5:34 in the morning is the Toyota driven by Mackenzie slowly approaching a right-hand turn. The turn signal is on, she's applying the brakes, and it's a very slow and controlled and deliberate right-hand.
There's a sound in the surveillance footage that nobody who's heard it can forget. It doesn't sound like a car crash, not at first. It sounds like something tearing open, like the world itself splitting along a seam it wasn't supposed to have. And then silence. That particular kind of silence that tells you, before any first responder arrives, before any 911 call is made, that something has gone permanently, irreversibly wrong. It's 5:34 in the morning, July 31st, 2022, Strongsville, Ohio, an industrial stretch of road that most people never drive down, empty, wide, and dark. And moving through that darkness is a silver Toyota Camry carrying 3 young people who just hours earlier were laughing, breathing, alive in the way that only teenagers can be alive, recklessly, completely, without thinking it could ever end. The driver is 17 years old. Her name is Mackenzie Shirilla. In the passenger seat is her boyfriend. His name is Dominic Russo. He's 20 years old. By counts, he is the love of her life, or at least that's how she'll describe him later, in a courtroom, when she's wearing a prison jumpsuit and everything has already been decided. In the back seat is Davon, Flanigan, 19 years old, funny, loyal, the kind of young man his family describes as a protector, the person who showed up always when someone needed him. None of them know that in less than 60 seconds, only one of them will be alive. The first surveillance camera catches the Camry making a right-hand turn. It's almost shockingly normal. The blinker is on. At 5:34 in the morning on a road with no other traffic for miles, the blinker is on. Mackenzie Shirilla, at that moment, looks like any careful driver navigating an unfamiliar road. And then something happens inside that car. We don't know exactly what was said. We don't know whose voice broke first, or what the words were, or how loud it got. What we know is what the second surveillance camera captures. The Camry screaming past the frame at 100 miles per hour. And then the sound, that sound. The car hits a concrete wall with the kind of force that investigators would later compare to falling from a 12-story building. Not swerving away at the last moment, not braking, not correcting, just straight into it. Full speed, full throttle. Dominic Russo and Davon Flanigan are killed on impact. Mackenzie Shirilla survives. And that survival, that single, improbable, medically inexplicable survival, becomes the first thread in one of the most complicated, emotionally devastating true crime cases Ohio has seen in years. Because the question everyone starts asking, almost immediately, isn't, how did she survive? It's, why did she do it? Before this night, before this wall, before this verdict, Mackenzie Shirilla is, by most accounts, a pretty ordinary teenager. She's 17. She's in love for the first time the way you're only ever in love for the first time, totally, overwhelmingly, in a way that makes everything else feel like background noise. Dominic Russo is 20, and the age gap matters, not because of some abstract principle, but because of what it creates in their dynamic, a kind of power imbalance that people who knew them describe as constant. On again, off again, passionate one day, explosive the next. The kind of relationship where both people are simultaneously the best and worst thing in each other's lives. People who were close to them describe fights that would escalate quickly, jealousy, accusations, the kind of emotional turbulence that feels, at 17, like the most important thing in the universe, because at 17 it genuinely is. You haven't yet developed the perspective to know that most of this passes. Most of it resolves. Most of the things that feel like the end of the world at 17 turn out to be chapters, not conclusions. But here's where Mackenzie Shirilla's story starts to take a darker turn, before any crash, before any wall. Because prosecutors will later present evidence, testimony from people who knew her, that Mackenzie had, on at least one prior occasion, made a specific threat. During an argument, a threat that she would crash the car. Think about that for a second. Because in a murder case, intent is everything. Intent is the whole game. The difference between a tragic accident and a crime is almost entirely the question of what was in someone's mind in the moments before something terrible happened. And if there is testimony, credible testimony that this specific threat, this specific action, had been verbalized before, that changes the entire landscape of what the crash means. The prosecutor's theory of the case begins to take shape. This wasn't the first time Mackenzie Shirilla had said this. This was the first time she'd followed through. Here's what nobody in that industrial park at 5:34 in the morning knows. The car is keeping a record. Every modern vehicle has what's called an event data recorder. A black box, essentially. And when investigators download the data from the Camry's black box in the aftermath of the crash, what they find becomes arguably the most important piece of evidence in the entire case. For 5 seconds before impact, the accelerator is fully depressed, not partially, not momentarily, fully, 100%. For 5 full seconds, Mackenzie Shirilla's right foot is pressing that gas pedal all the way to the floor. And here's the thing about 5 seconds that people often don't appreciate until someone really spells it out. 5 seconds is a long time. Count it out right now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In 5 seconds, a competent driver can recognize a hazard, react, apply the brakes, and stop from highway speed. In 5 seconds, someone who accidentally drifted too fast has time to correct. In 5 seconds, a person who fell asleep at the wheel wakes up. For 5 seconds, Mackenzie Shirilla does not brake, does not swerve, does not lift her foot, not even slightly. The black box also tells investigators that no steering correction was attempted. The car goes straight, at 100 miles per hour, straight into a wall. Prosecutors stand in front of a judge and say, "This is not the data of an accident. This is the data of a decision." And it's here that the case transforms. Because up until this point, you could, if you wanted to be generous, if you wanted to assume the best, imagine some scenario where this is a horrible, tragic accident. A teenager driving too fast, a moment of panic, a failure of judgment measured in milliseconds. But the black box eliminates the millisecond argument. 5 seconds is a deliberate choice. 5 seconds is a direction your body commits to and holds. Mackenzie Shirilla is released from the hospital. 2 of her friends are dead. The community is grieving. An investigation is underway. And Mackenzie Shirilla goes on TikTok. Now, let's be careful here, because this part of the story is where emotion and evidence start to get tangled in ways that matter legally and humanly. The TikTok videos are not evidence of murder. A teenager going on social media after a traumatic event is not by itself proof of anything, except that teenagers sometimes make catastrophically bad decisions about optics. But here's what she posts, and here's how it lands. In one video, she says, and I'm summarizing because the exact phrasing matters less than the spirit, that she's just one of those people who can do a lot of drugs and not die. She's smiling, she seems unbothered. She seems, to anyone watching, completely disconnected from the reality that 2 people she loved are in the ground. The internet responds with the kind of collective fury that only the internet can generate. Death threats, harassment, organized campaigns. Her face is everywhere. The comments are not printable. And here's the tragic irony buried inside all of this. The social media response, as visceral and understandable as it is, may actually complicate the path to justice rather than accelerating it. Because when the public decides someone is guilty before a trial begins, when the noise becomes deafening, it makes every subsequent legal decision harder to evaluate clearly. Was this prosecution driven by evidence or by outrage? Can those 2 things be cleanly separated? 3 months after the crash, surveillance footage captures Mackenzie at a concert. In a wheelchair, but out, attending an event, smiling in photographs, and the internet has another eruption. Her mother will later explain, at sentencing in front of the judge, that she and her husband encouraged Mackenzie to go, that their daughter had spent 3 months in bed, wearing Dominic's clothes, eating his favorite foods, listening only to music he had written, that the concert was, in her mother's words, just a moment of fun, just one moment. You can hold both things at once. The mother's explanation can be entirely genuine and heartfelt, and the optics can still be catastrophically damaging. Both things can be true. Usually, in cases like this, both things are true. Months pass, the investigation deepens, and then detectives come for Mackenzie Shirilla. We have video of the arrest, and it becomes immediately another flashpoint. The detective is calm, professional, almost gentle. He introduces himself. He tells her she's under arrest for aggravated murder. And Mackenzie's response, her immediate, unfiltered, completely unself-aware response, is to ask the officer to be careful removing her bracelet so it doesn't break. She's worried about her jewelry. Now, again, let's be fair. This is a 17-year-old, now 18, in a state of shock, in a situation she may not fully be processing, being placed in handcuffs. The brain does strange things under extreme stress. It fixates on small, manageable things because the large, unmanageable things are too enormous to hold. Psychologists have documented this extensively. It's not necessarily evidence of callousness, but it looks like callousness. And in a case where public perception has already cemented her as a villain, every moment like this adds another layer to a narrative that is increasingly difficult to escape. She asks the officer to help her step over a floor mat. She fusses with hair extensions. She apologizes for how difficult they are to remove, and the officer, to his considerable credit, is patient, gentle even, treats her with dignity she has not by most public accounts earned. The footage goes viral, again. The response is again volcanic. And somewhere in the middle of all of this noise and fury, a trial begins to take shape. Here is a decision that surprises almost everyone who follows the legal side of this case closely. Mackenzie Shirilla's defense team chooses a bench trial. No jury, just a judge. Now, if you know anything about criminal defense strategy, you know that bench trials are chosen for very specific reasons. Usually, it's because the defendant's legal team has gotten good signals from the judge pre-trial, skeptical questions during hearings, favorable rulings on motions, a sense that the judge sees the case the way the defense sees it. In cases with sympathetic defendants and complicated facts, a single reasonable judge can sometimes get to a not guilty verdict that 12 jurors, swayed by emotion, by optics, by the noise of the world outside, might never reach. But Mackenzie Shirilla is not a sympathetic defendant, not publicly. And the question that hangs over the decision to waive a jury is this: do you want to be the judge who sets her free? Think about what that means. A sitting judge in this community, looking at this evidence, this defendant, this outrage, voting to acquit. That judge has to live in this community. That judge has to face election cycles or retention votes or simply the daily reality of being a human being in a place where people have very strong feelings about what happened on that industrial road at 5:34 in the morning. It's an enormous ask. And whatever the pre-trial strategy was, whatever signals the defense team thought they were reading, it doesn't go the way they hoped. The judge's words at the conclusion of the bench trial are precise, deliberate, and unsparing. She says that the surveillance video, Exhibit 802, crystallizes the deadly decision-making of the defendant. She says Mackenzie Shirilla transformed in the span of a single turn from a responsible driver into, and this is the judge's language, literal hell on wheels. She says the evidence of purpose and intent is clear. Guilty, 2 counts of murder, 4 counts of felonious assault, aggravated vehicular homicide, drug possession, possessing criminal tools. The charges merge for sentencing purposes, as they often do, because the law recognizes that one act, however layered its consequences, is still one act. And the sentences that survive the merger are the ones that will define the rest of Mackenzie Shirilla's young life. At the moment the verdict is read, people who are watching later describe Mackenzie as appearing genuinely shocked. Not performing shock, actually surprised in the way someone is surprised when they truly believed, that a different outcome was possible. And that shock, that specific flavor of disbelief, tells you something about how Mackenzie Shirilla sees herself versus how the court sees her. There's a gap there, a significant, unbridgeable gap, and that gap is going to matter at sentencing. At sentencing, Mackenzie Shirilla is invited to speak, and this is the moment, the one moment, when everything she says matters more than anything she has said or done since the crash. Because what a judge needs to see at sentencing from a defendant who has just been convicted of murder is accountability. Not necessarily a full concession to every element of the prosecution's theory. Not I did it on purpose and I'm evil, but something real. Something that demonstrates an understanding of what has been lost and why that loss matters and what responsibility means. What she delivers is brief. It's apologetic in a surface-level way. She says she would never have let this happen on purpose. She says she wishes she could remember what happened. She says Dominic was her soulmate. She addresses Dominic's family. She barely addresses Davon's, and then she sits down. Her attorney, if they're honest with themselves in the car ride home, knows that wasn't enough. It wasn't close to enough. The rest of her life was on the table at that podium, and she handed it back without putting up much of a fight. Her mother, Natalie, speaks next. And this part is both heartbreaking and instructive because it illustrates something true and painful about the way love can distort our ability to see clearly. Natalie Shirilla is, by every visible measure, a mother who loves her daughter completely and unconditionally. She talks about how Dominic was family, how Mackenzie wore only his clothes for 3 months after the crash, how the concert, the Halloween outing, all of it was done in his honor. She paints a picture of a daughter consumed by grief. And then the judge, the same judge who just convicted Mackenzie of murder, interrupts her gently and says something that lands like a stone in still water. "I'm hearing an awful lot about your daughter. I'm not hearing very much about the 2 dead people." The courtroom goes quiet. Natalie pivots. She tries to explain. She calls it a tragic accident. And the judge says quietly that they'll have to disagree on that. And that exchange contains, compressed into about 90 seconds, the entire emotional truth of this case. A mother who cannot bring herself to see her daughter clearly. A judge who has looked at every piece of evidence and sees only what the evidence shows. And somewhere in between, 2 families who have come to this courtroom carrying a weight that no sentence, however long, is going to lift. Part 9. The victim impact statements. Before the sentence is handed down, the families of Davon Flanigan and Dominic Russo speak. And I want to give this section the space it deserves, because this is the part of the case that tends to get swallowed by the noise surrounding Mackenzie. The TikToks, the social media, the legal arguments, the Netflix documentary. This is the part that is, in many ways, the whole point. Davon Flanigan's mother speaks first. She describes her son as an amazing soul. She talks about the specific irreplaceable role he played in their family, their protector, the one constant her daughters had known since childhood. She talks about the future he'll never have. His sister, 18 years old, standing at a podium in a room full of grief, talking about the big brother who made her feel safe, says something that quietly devastates everyone in the room. She says that since Davon died, she feels stuck, that he was the one who picked her up when she fell, that she was the person who had been with her since the day she was born, and now she has to figure out how to live in a world he's no longer in. She asks the judge for the longest possible sentence. Then Dominic's mother speaks. And what she says about the morning of the crash, the detail that has never really gotten enough attention, is that she only called Natalie Shirilla from the hospital to tell her that her son was dead. The first thing Natalie said to her was, "Please don't listen to what everyone's saying on Facebook." Her son was dead. And the first words from the other mother were about social media. She doesn't say this with anger in the transcript. She delivers it almost matter-of-factly, as a data point, as an illustration of a worldview she finds incomprehensible. And it lands harder, somehow, than any raised voice would have. She says Mackenzie showed no mercy on Dominic or on Davon. She says only God can have mercy on her soul now. And then she sits down. The judge's sentencing remarks are extraordinary, not because of what she imposes, 15 years to life on each murder count, running concurrently, but because of what she says before she imposes it. She says Mackenzie chose a specific route, an obscure industrial road she had scouted previously. She chose the specific night, one that fell just before Mackenzie's 18th birthday, a detail prosecutors found significant. She chose the method. She chose the target. She addresses the defense's claim that Mackenzie had a medical condition, a seizure disorder or blackout episodes that could explain the crash, and she dismantles it methodically. Mackenzie had denied any medical condition when she applied for her driver's license, and then, just after the crash, renewed that license and denied any medical condition again. A condition that appears for the first time at trial, with no medical records, no documented history, and no prior disclosure. That is not a medical defense. That is a last resort. She says something else that is legally significant and often gets lost in the emotion of the case. She says, even if Mackenzie intended to also die in this crash, that is irrelevant. A failed suicide attempt is not a defense to murder. Think about the implications of that. If the defense theory is that Mackenzie was suicidal, that this was a murder-suicide in which the intended victim, Mackenzie herself, happened to survive, the law's response is, it doesn't matter. If you drive a car into a wall intending to kill yourself and 2 other people die, you are responsible for their deaths. Full stop. And then the judge says something that is, in its own way, more haunting than any of the legal language. There is a very good likelihood, Mackenzie, that you will spend the rest of your life in prison. That won't be up to me. That will be up to the parole board. And that will be up to you to a great extent. To a great extent, meaning who you become in there. Whether you find the accountability you didn't display at sentencing. Whether the parole board, when they meet the 33-year-old version of Mackenzie Shirilla, sees someone who has genuinely reckoned with what she did. Or someone who still, at some fundamental level, doesn't believe she's a murderer. That question is unresolved. It will remain unresolved for years. A Netflix documentary about this case reignites everything: the debates, the camps. The Mackenzie defenders who insist the prosecution was driven by social media hatred rather than evidence. The victim advocates who insist that two young men are dead and the person who killed them is getting treated like a sympathetic figure by documentary filmmakers more interested in moral complexity than moral clarity. And here's what I think is true after looking at all of it carefully. The social media outrage was real. The public hatred of Mackenzie Shirilla was, and remains, outsized, personal, and sometimes frightening in its intensity. None of that is justice. None of that is appropriate. And the evidence of murder was also real. The black box doesn't lie. 5 seconds of full acceleration with no braking and no steering correction is not the signature of an accident. It's the signature of a commitment. The prior threats documented by witnesses, the deliberately chosen route, the timing, it all points in the same direction. Both things are true. The prosecution was not invented by social media. The conviction has evidentiary legs. And Mackenzie Shirilla, whatever her interior life, whatever her genuine grief over Dominic Russo, made choices on the morning of July 31st in 2022 that ended 2 lives and destroyed countless others. What justice looks like in this case is a question that won't be answered in a courtroom. It'll be answered slowly over the next 15 years in a prison visiting room or a parole board hearing or a quiet moment when Mackenzie Shirilla, whoever she becomes, finally stops explaining what she didn't mean to do and starts sitting with what she did. Davon Flanigan was 19 years old. He was someone's son, someone's protector, someone's best friend. He didn't choose to get in that car knowing it would be his last ride. Dominic Russo was 20 years old. He was, by the account of the girl who says she loved him more than anything, the love of her life. And the person who loved him most drove him into a wall at 100 miles per hour and somehow survived. There's no narrative that makes that okay. There's no documentary framing that resolves it. There's only the truth, sitting where the truth always sits, heavy, unmoving, permanent. And 2 families who are never going to be whole again.